and Urban Landscapes. Got it. Talk largely about staging urban landscapes and use that platform as a way of also describing the Strand, which is ongoing in London. It's due to open on the 6th, so it's very exciting. You can see down at the bottom some social handles if you want to follow along, both staging urban landscapes. You can find me also on Instagram if you are following along socials. And I am active on Twitter as well. And then our company website is there too. So I always like to start this conversation really on where I came from. So Nadia mentioned that I come from Middle America. That red dot is the state of Colorado. This was the landscape in which I grew up, in an arid, rural part of the world, really, that's right in the southwest corner of Colorado. So it actually borders New Mexico and Arizona. So you have the Rockies, but you also then have these desert landscapes. And it was a very isolated place in truth. I mean, my town is there on the left, Bayfield. It was one of those communities where you would celebrate if you had a stoplight and you knew everyone, every family knew everyone. And this is my actual house, just here is where I grew up. My closest neighbor and friend was up here about a mile away. And you might be asking yourself, well, great, what does that have to do with staging urban landscapes? And I think the key thing really is that when you grow up in an environment like this, the concept of public space doesn't really exist. And I think in large parts of probably where you are, and certainly in America, public space isn't really that well regarded because you have your own territory, you have your own back garden. Mine was a national forest, which you can see in this image. So I moved to London in 2003 after graduating, and I was cycling to and from work, and I would come across this space. This is the National Theatre, just outside the National Theatre, called Watch This Space. It's on the really lively, active south bank of the Thames River. And I was observing, these are all my photographs, and I was observing how a very simple design, in truth, is actually brought to life by what's going on in it. The design itself, its actual bones, if you were, is a series of steps, which you can see on the left, an open plaza, and then the way in which Dennis Lasden, who's the architect, created these terraces within the building, perhaps you can see best in this image below, to also then become more of a spectator area. And it opened, I would say, a whole different way in which I was beginning to understand design and understand what we do as designers. I was also observing spaces like this, a really nondescript piece of lawn on the left. It's 10 meters by 10 meters. It's not huge, 30 feet by 30 feet. But in the middle of lunch hour, it turns into a place. You know, everyone comes, they crowd, they get sunshine, they have their lunch. And this rhythm of the city, the way in which spaces are brought to life and activated through those quotidian rhythms, is really important for us to understand as designers. So I would say largely I was really becoming an observer of how we use the city, how we occupy it, how we influence it. This is a space very close to the National Theatre. It's called the Arena. It's a public art project, in truth. And this idea that you create these moments on the left through the structure. So someone had the idea to create this, what feels like a formal amphitheater in a way, a space that has an edge, it's contained, and then it's brought to life through the community events, whether it is dancing, whether it's more formal, where you bring in sand and there's a community engagement with that. And I became intrigued at this moment, I think, particularly around scale and how do we design a space that doesn't feel too large, where this one gentleman on the left is walking through, but at the same moment, it can allow spaces and events like this to expand and have more dynamism and bring the energy of the city into it. This is under the nearby bridge. So these three spaces I'm showing you are working in tandem in a way. You have the arena, you have the Watch This Space, and you have underneath the bridge, which you can see on the left here, a series of these black boxes. Those contain all of these books that come out and form this book fair. So you have this notion of under infrastructure that has no real purpose, no real use, brought to life through that installation and engagement. And as I say, I was becoming an observer. This is in downtown Manhattan. I walked by on the way to work one day. It looked like this, a pretty uninspiring pedestrian sidewalk footpath. And I came back at lunch and it looked like this, when the commerce of someone who's selling plants suddenly transformed what it looks like, but also how you feel when you move through that, just through the introduction of the plants that were on sale. So over the course of the time that I was in London, that was between 2003 until I went back to graduate school. So about a decade, I was observing the city and capturing all of these things, which really set up the idea of creating a book. So I went back to to the GSD, and it gave me a chance to really try to research in depth and try to understand this. And I would argue that largely the notion of the activation of space began with the agora. This is an image of the ancient agora, which was really this place where everything happened. You came there, you would converse with people, you would talk politics. If it was modern times, you'd talk about the latest Netflix series. And it was through that engagement with just talking and connecting with people that it was activating this part of the city. And what's happened is we've lost that. And you have other instances. This is Piazza del Campo in Siena, great, incredible fortified medieval town. And this is a really early example of how design was using architecture to create a space of a certain scale that would have a particular use. This is the Palio, which is, you can see the horses running around the center of a collection of people. So it was designed knowing that there was going to be this annual event called the Palio. So it's some of the earliest indications of how designers, city makers were thinking about the activation of space and how space would be used by the community. Incredible image here when we see it in full swing also. So this is an ancient tradition, but it's still ongoing. People flock to Siena to see it. I love this diagram. This is by Jan Gehl Architects, and it starts to speak to the loss of the activation of space through those daily rhythms. So on the left is 1880, the idea that you go, you buy your candlesticks, you get your shoes fixed, you buy your bread, you do the daily things that we were doing before we had cars. You were walking to shops to get those things. You were meeting your neighbors, you were bumping into people, and therefore you were activating those spaces. And as vehicles have come, as cars have become more prevalent, we've lost that. So this diagram is suggesting that through the process of bringing cars in, we have to now work twice as hard to bring those spaces that are really, really working well, that are celebrated, that have the atmosphere, that have the quality, that have the flexibility. As designers, as city makers, we have to work really hard now, because you can just sit in the car and you can drive to these places and you have your own environments. So we've lost that rhythm, and it's now about how do we fight back? How do we bring spaces back to the cities that people can occupy? Another key seminal moment was The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces by William H. White. And this is really, I would say, where observation became fundamental to how we design, how we think about cities, how we think about our public spaces. And he was looking at Seagram's Plaza, particularly at the ledges, and really documenting almost as a forensic investigator about how people use space, where they sit, why they sit there, what works with bringing food in, what works with bringing music into these spaces. So it was the first indication, I suppose, of how you can really get under the skin of human behavior to understand how, when you're making design moves, you're thinking about the end user, or you're thinking about how the people will actually occupy and use that space. And he created these notational diagrams. So on the left is a section of those ledges of Seagram's Plaza, and he was documenting the duration of the stay of the people within that plaza, how long they stayed there, why they stayed there, where they were sitting. And the correlation really was about the movement of the sun. Was the first thing they noticed, is that when the sun hit, that's where the people wanted to sit, on those ledges that had the most sun, that were most visible, for instance, to passersby, etc. So that was a real seminal moment, I would say, for beginning to think about how people use space and how that influences the design. Another key one around this idea of staging, the notion that there's a space that events and installations and cultural moments can happen, was the Pompidou Center competition right in the heart of Paris that was one at a time by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano. And this image really was one of their early iterations, early montages about trying to capture the notion of the visibility of the building being brought out into that public space and creating a plaza that would have an interface with the building. And then I came across this really interesting one that has the color. It just brings this kind of notion of installations and cultural back in there. But the key thing also with this drawing is this idea of the facade, the elevation of the building being a component of those installations. So suddenly you have this reciprocity between architecture, between plaza, and the two working together. And the other fundamental thing about this competition was this is the actual site. That is the ownership boundary. So there was this really important decision that was made along the lines of this competition for the architects and the designers to say, let's not occupy the entire footprint of the building. Let's carve out what was called the parvis or the square. Let's create that platform that has the direct interface with the building. It brings that life both to the Pompidou Center. So people are coming obviously to see the Pompidou Center, but they might also now inherently come to see the activities that are going on in the square. So it was a really important moment for us to really begin to understand how space in the city plays such a critical role. And this, I think, was a stepping off point for us to begin to think about the idea of staging and activation and program. So this is the parvis, this is how it's used now, looking down from a Pompidou. So this idea of an open-ended, flexible platform, there's not a lot of complexity to the design. It is a slightly sloping plaza that looks to the Pompidou Center, but it gives you the opportunity for events like this to take place. And then moving on to program, another key seminal moment for the discipline of architecture, I would say, is Parc de la Villette competition, which was actually won by Bernard Schumi, but it's these drawings by OMA that are often discussed, and I would have thought Nadia's probably showing you these in also your work and your studies that you're going through there now, because it was really the first time I would suggest, or that when architects were starting to think about program as a way of spatializing and beginning to lay out their design. So you can see the number of different layers in which they were beginning to occupy. And Rem puts it like this: nature, whether the thematic discovery gardens or real nature, will also be treated as program. Blocks or screens of trees and the various gardens will act like different planes of a stage set. They will convey the illusion of different landscapes of depth without offering in passing the substance. So a key trajectory on this idea of where we I think we are now in city making. So I then, as a result of starting to unpick some of this, reflected on my own education and the lead up to where I was as a landscape architect. And I was educated in the late 90s, early 2000s, when really it was still largely about landscape as art, which was led and dominated by Peter Walker, Martha Schwartz, George Hargraves, and others, that really was looking, I would say, prioritizing, privileging composition over how people would use it in particular, but also potentially the activation and flexibility of it. So I can remember as a student waiting in spaces for people to get out of the way so I could take a photograph of the space. Right? It was about the composition. It was about how things came together, materials, form, shape. It was less about how people occupied and used that space. And it's beautiful. I have to really reiterate, their work is exceptional. The quality of detailing, the imagination is so strong. So really it's about marking that moment that was in the trajectory of our discipline, and we're moving now into another epoch, another chapter of what we as landscape architects are doing. So the work of Peter Walker here, Martha Schwartz, the installations, notions of geometry, overlaying geometries, Harlequin Plaza by George Hargraves, again, really bold colors, but this is composition, right? There's no people in here, there's no suggestion about what they might do or how it might be used. It was about the canvas, about what it looks like and how you pull things together and create that form, those shapes. Even, the great gold frogs that Martha's done. This is the Rio Shopping Center, 1989. So don't see many of these anymore. But again, just, the exceptional detail, geometry, how they came together. But it was, very much about landscape as art. So what was missing? And it was really this. It was these moments of serendipities, moments of people occupying cities and taking ownership in their city in a way that they wanted to. And we are creative creatures. And I think what you come to find when you begin to look at landscapes and public spaces through this lens, you begin to really register how people sit and occupy space, how they use it. And at the same moment, I just need to minimize this because I can't actually read the text. At the same moment that this design shift was going on in professional work, there was also a shift going on in academia. So this is James Corner writing in actually 1996. It feels around the early 90s, the shift was really going on. And I think this is a critical point that he picks up. The emphasis shifts from landscape as a product of culture to landscape as an agent producing and enriching culture. Landscape as noun or object or scene, as object or scene, is quieted in order to emphasize landscape as verb. as process or activity. So if you think about those images I just showed you and described from Peter Walker, Martha, and George, that was really about object or scene. It was about the noun of landscape, what it looks like, what you see, and Corner's arguing for this idea of the landscape as verb, as in what's going on, what is the landscape doing, what is the process or activation. So around that same time, 1996, there was this project by West Aid, by Adrian Hughes, right in the heart of Rotterdam. And this was, I would argue, the project that really shifted the pendulum for us to begin to think about design in the same way. This idea of creating open-endedness, creating flexibility, and moving away from the notion of composition. So it's a fairly simple plane. It's this open area here, a void in the city, a strong seating edge facing into the sun. So you have the warmth, you have those edges. And then it's really about what happens next. What do the citizens do? How does the city activate it? How do you bring in cultural programs, etc.? And then also, as you'll probably know this project as well, the animation of the cranes, these large scale red cranes that bring spotlights into the square and transform participants into performers. So these great shadows that you can see in this incredible diagram that they produced also begins to speak to this idea of animation, soft activation of people moving through the space. This is one of the diagrams in the book, so hopefully we'll have some time to talk a bit more about the structure of the book. But what I'm trying to do here is deconstruct these case studies, these seminal case studies, to understand scale, to understand the component parts, to understand edge condition, the relationship to edge condition to open space. Jan Gehl talks a lot about the edge condition, the importance of having your back against something, looking out across this wide open plain. And he tries to link that to our previous ancestors that were, looking across the plains, making sure their back was safe, they weren't going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So there's elements that we have that are embedded in our DNA that allow us to feel comfort in public space. So this diagram really was trying to understand those different component pieces of the urban theater that West Aid had produced. So this is, one of those moments when you have this great spotlight, you bring people together, you create a moment, create an event. But this is really about that flat, open-ended stage that allows you to begin to experiment and allows space for the unknown. They also do these, pretty significant installations. Someone's taken time to design this, to lay it out, to model it, etc. So it's a space large enough that begins to give you that flex, to swell, to expand, depending on what the audience is, depending on the scale of the installation. So we'll come to talk about scale, but I think I would argue, as both a practitioner and someone who's trying to educate the next generation, scale is the most underdeveloped thing that we have in our repertoire. Our ability to understand scale, I think, is the most critical aspect of design that takes a huge amount of time to understand it, to really put yourself in a space through 3D design, comparing it to other spaces that are similar scale. But it is often undercooked or overlooked, and I think we really need to focus more on understanding scale and how we design scale. So another thing that was going on in the early 90s was this idea of infrastructure, this idea of embedding the landscape with instrumentation that you can plug into. So a plug and play where you might have anchor points, you could put a marquee down, or bollards that would fold up, that West Aid also did in Binnenrot in Rotterdam. So this idea of having program and infrastructure beginning to come together, this is an incredible diagram by Stan Allen in Points and Lines, which I encourage you to look at. This was a competition they were doing in Barcelona. And he comes to describe it like this: infrastructures are flexible and anticipatory. They work with time and are open to change. By specifying what must be fixed and what is subject to change, they can be precise and indeterminate at the same time. They work through management and cultivation, changing slowly to adjust to shifting conditions. They do not progress towards a predetermined state, as with master planning strategies, but are always evolving with a loose envelope of constraints. And I think that the key thing to take from this piece of text is this idea of, one, precise, but also indeterminate. So you're thinking very precisely about how you're designing it, those areas that you're leaving open, but you're also leaving areas that are indeterminate, that are unfixed, that could be used in a multitude of ways. So I mentioned corner earlier. So Recovering Landscapes, this collection of essays that came out in 1999, was pulling together some of this thinking, this intellectual pursuits as far as how we were shifting away from composition, shifting away from landscape as noun to landscape as verb, from scene to process. And one of the key essays in that was by Alex Wall. And here he's also beginning to describe the landscape in a different way, similar to what we just saw with the Stan Allen and also with the corner text. So here the term landscape no longer refers to prospects of pastoral innocence, but rather invokes the functioning matrix of connective tissue that organizes not only objects and spaces, but also the dynamic processes and events that move through them. So it's indeterminate, it's about organization, it's about thinking how space can be used in a multitude of ways. The grafting of new instruments and equipment onto strategically staged surfaces. So surfaces we're starting to hear about, platforms, stages, surfaces, is certainly not something that you would have heard Martha Schwartz and Peter Walker describe. Allows for a transformation of the ground plane into a living connective tissue between increasingly disparate fragments and unforeseen programs. So I'm going to shift now and I'm going to take you into London. If any of you have been to London, you might recognize this building, but you certainly won't recognize it in this form. This is Somerset House, right in the heart of London. It's not too close to the historic geographical heart of London as well. It is now, I would argue, the cultural epicenter to the capital, or certainly has unlocked a lot of suggestions about how landscape and how public space can be used as culture. But historically, it was a car park for the Inland Revenue Service. So this is 2000. This is the year 2000. So this is only 20 years ago that one of our key public spaces looked like this, dominated by cars, no culture, no use. It now hosts events like this. So the Film 4 Summer Series brings in ice skating. It was the first outdoor ice skating venue where really you begin to see the city as a place that could be occupied and activated in this way. They work with music, and it also just happens to be adjacent to the Strand project, which I'll come to describe. So Somerset House sits here. That courtyard I was just showing you images of sits there. And this is the Strand project that I've been working on since now 2018, so coming up to 4 years now. And what's really interesting about the project, and the first thing that we did, in fact, was to go through all of the different cultural events that are already in place that happen throughout the calendar, the annual calendar. One, to know that those were going on. So there's a lot now going on that are planned, programmed, and anticipated. But also, increasingly important, are what goes on around the world, these kind of international events and installations that happen in different cities, either simultaneously or at different times. So Dinner en Blanc, for instance, has happened in New York. It's happened here in London. Could have happened here in the Strand, for instance, as well. And also traveling installations and traveling art, I think, are important pieces for us to consider also. So the ones that I've highlighted here are actually ones that happen in the space, or could happen with, could take place because of the context that they're in. So already there was a huge amount of culture going on, huge amount of opportunity for us to tap into. It also has a rhythm. So there's 2 universities. There's obviously people that are commuting through the space. It's right next to the theater land. So everyone who's going to the West End to see live theater will pass through the space as well. Has 2 embassies. So there's a lot of different people that will ultimately use the space. But it has these natural ebbs and flows, peaks at lunch hour, dips down for around 3 o'clock when people are at work, and then comes back to life. So how do you begin to design, again, with those rhythms? So we wanted to create a space for the everyday that can also host a calendar of events that's permanent, but also ephemeral, tranquil, and energetic. So these dialectics, the kind of tensions of public space, I think, are most evident certainly in the Strand. So this was the site when we started. It's a one-way traffic system. So the traffic would come around like this. It would come back through the space, go around this church. This church is historically has the most protection that any architecture can have in London. It's a grade 1 star listed church. That's a historic designation by Historic England. And for 150 years, it has been isolated by either traffic as we know it today or by horse and carriage. So it's always been this east-west connector, never, ever really been a space for people. And it's a convergence of old and new in London. So this is actually, these buildings here and the buildings that wrap around are only 100 years old. The Strand itself, we have maps from AD 190. So you have this really interesting tension of old and new coming together. The trees that you can see there, the London planes, were planted at the time that these buildings went in. So they're about 100 years old. So really the transformation is about those big infrastructural moves to transform the movement of the traffic to make two-way here, and for this to become largely a pedestrian space. Buses still come around here, but from this point onwards, it's a public space except for deliveries, emergency vehicles, etc., and installations. So it's that shift of traffic alone was a massive transformation. It went from a place of movement, a place of getting from A to B, to a place where you could stop, you could dwell, you could look at this architecture, impressive collection of grade 1 listed architecture. And also then for all of the different institutions, the universities, the art institutions at Somerset House, the embassies, the first time for all of those people to come together and begin to cross-pollinate, to share ideas, to learn about what's going on in the different buildings, etc. So this gives you an aerial view to give you a sense of the scale of the space, what's going on in it. St. Mary the Strand, as I mentioned, the jewel in the Strand as it's described now is this grade 1 star listed church, which really is going to have a brand new lease on life. You know, the ability to have an interface with the public space now, to not have to buffer the traffic noise. You can see the pollution from the traffic coming through the joints of the stonework there. It's had that much kind of pollution. So it's going to be an incredible transformation. So I'll come to describe a bit about how the layout has come about and how we're starting to think about this subject of staging urban landscapes also in the project. But the key thing, in fact, let me just run through these diagrams. So we started with some of the context, the constraints, the things we couldn't move. So the edges of the space, the existing trees, the church in the center. To then create this idea of a sanctuary in the city, to expand the notions of stepping into the landscape, to be enveloped by that, for it to be quiet, etc. And again, to create space connected to the adjacent buildings. To then think about a south-facing edge. So the reason south-facing is important, particularly in London, is that's where the sun's going to hit. So when the sun is out in London, the city transforms. It really does. People come out, their behavior is different, their moods are happier. Right now we're in the deep doldrums of winter. It feels like it's been raining every day. So there hasn't been a lot of positivity in the city. But so understanding where the sun hits, how people are going to use it is really important. There's this really interesting urban grain to the architecture where you have these large frontages like Somerset House and King's, and then you have this really beautiful infill architecture. So we wanted to bring some of that into the space and allow that to inform the way in which the organization of the geometry or the layout of the space works. So that's what those arrows are drawing in. They're starting to set up the structure of the landscape and bring that side of the street into the space. So that forms the organizational band, as we've called it. And then the idea was to set up a series of rooms, a series of moments within that organizational band that allows, mostly it just gives people a choice. It allows them to determine how they want to sit in the space, how they want to occupy it, what they might do there. So we have, moving from west to east, we have the garden room, spectator edge, the social seat moves through here. We have a collective dining area here. So if you want to sit with your friends and colleagues over lunch, you have a moment to do that. Workstations, so you could bring your work outside and work in the public space, and then a garden walk and lawns on that edge, and then the sanctuary. So giving them names, giving them an identity, I think is an important part of what we do as designers as well. So thinking, how do you bring some specificity, some site specificity to your designs as well? And then, where are those areas of open-endedness, indeterminacy, all the prelude to this moment that I've shown in the presentations? How do you create those platforms that could have different things going on, different events, different installations that aren't too big that they feel empty, isolated, windswept, uninviting, but at the same moment can allow that flexibility. So we began to identify the areas that we thought we could program, that we could allow the client to program and the cultural institutions adjacent to it to program. And like with any research, Nadia will be able to tell you this, the minute you publish a book, you then find all these incredible entries that you didn't come across until you'd already published. So I'd finished Staging Urban Landscapes, and I was rereading the Downs View competition. It's called Case by Julia Zerniak, which was a critique of the Downs View competition that was going on in, again, the late 90s. And Anita Berzbetti has written this essay called Scales of Undecidability. And this is 20 years ago now, talking about flexibility. So flexibility has been a double-edged sword. For although it enables functional and programmatic openness, it has also generated countless unarticulated, weak, and generic landscapes. So we are very much in this world right now of trying to think about flexibility, but also at the same moment, making sure that we don't create weak and generic landscapes that all look the same, because everyone's thinking, let's just leave some open plazas, let's put some red chairs in. You lose that character, you lose the uniqueness if you're not thinking really hard about the open-endedness of it. So we also, through the process working with the stakeholders, wanted it to be something different. So not just a space that's getting the same sort of events, the food trucks, the ping pong tables, etc. But could the activation here be about the idea of art being made rather than displayed, rehearsals rather than performances, and making sure the knowledge that was going on in these institutions is being shared rather than stored away? So this is outside actually the Gund Hall at the GSD, where they were learning to build rammed earth walls. And that process of learning became the activation, it became the installation, it became the object. But really the process of it being made was also bringing the activation to the spaces. This is outside the AA, again, students testing ideas. And if you're walking past this becomes a moment. You stop, you're interested in what's going on. That then attracts other people to stop, and that's how people gather and an atmosphere is created. William H. White talks about this as activation, triangulation, sorry. He talks about triangulation, that when people start to have something to talk about, they have a conversation, they stop, that gathers more people. And he has a very obvious observation where he says people attract people. And that's very true. If you see a collection of people in a crowd, I challenge you to not to walk over and see what's going on. We have this curiosity about us. And again, just testing objects in the public space, again, outside the UAA. So we went through a number of drawings. This is the existing condition. We went through to show how collective dining, how the workstations would look, how green, more planting, seasonal change would also improve the area. These wide open streets dominated by traffic become gardens, become sanctuary. Place that's just dominated by cars that are actually going nowhere because it's a one-way system. So you hit congestion and they just sit there spewing out their fumes. Could be completely taken away. And here it is, that open-endedness, that flexibility, that platform with a really good edge condition, south-facing edge condition along here and along here, that would face onto the space where installations, events could take place. And I think this is the most powerful sequence of images. So this is, when I started, this is what it looked like. It was 4 lanes of traffic. There's the church that I just described stuck behind all of this, double-decker buses. You really have no sense of wanting to be in this space, right? It's a hostile environment. It's smelly, it's loud, it's polluted. That traffic switch happened in September of last year. So that's the moment when the traffic was taken from a one-way system to a two-way system. And that allowed what was called September on the Strand to take place, where they built in situ a new skateboard park. And this was here for a couple of months. But again, this idea that you could watch the skate park being built, it wasn't something that was prefabbed offsite and dropped in there. It was people who were coming through the space day to day, they could see it actually being created and then see the end result in the skaters. And then this is the final, which is starting to look like this. We got a ways to go, but it's getting close. You know, the traffic's been removed, the surface seating's been done, some of the planting's going in, the seating's going in. And this will be the next chapter, I suppose, for the Strand until we see how it performs. And it's a chance, I think, for the client, for the stakeholders to test it, to see, how is it performing? What does it need? What are we missing? And then they can adapt and they can invest further into it. This is quite a moment for us when this just came about. It's called the social seat. So that's one of those moments along the space that I showed you before. And it was a chance to be expressive, to show some personality, to bring some of the artistic endeavor that goes on in Somerset House out into the public space, and really just to bring a sense of joy and delight and unexpectedness into the public space. You don't see this sort of installation that often. So it's 40 meters long, 57 different colors of chairs. And we haven't had a chance to see how people respond to it because it has not stopped raining since this went in. So I also often describe creating seating where it can become sculptural when it's not being used as a seat. So there's nothing worse than a bench that people don't sit in, I guess. They're usually pretty utilitarian, but how can we design furniture that is sculptural when it's not used as a seat? And I think the work that Chris Reed at Stoss with their plaza at Harvard, that's a great example of that, which I'll hopefully if we have time, come to talk about that as well. But a couple of shots of that going in, really exciting, just bringing color into the public space. Right. A couple of other key observations that I have in the book that I think we're right in the thick of right now. So one of those is the rise of the installation culture. Really, I would say championed by PS1 in New York, where they have the framework, they have these courtyards that are defined by cast concrete walls, which you can see here, but every year they invite a young architect to come and do an installation. And that in turn creates this atmosphere, creates this energy, creates that sense of anticipation that something's coming the next year. And it's also a great opportunity for young emerging designers to have a chance to design something incredible. The other one, certainly here in London, is the Serpentine Pavilion. And I would say that this is one of those pioneering experimentations that has unlocked a lot of these other annual installations to take place. And I talk about in the book that it really transforms a flat, empty grass area in Kensington Gardens into a cultural destination for a couple of months. They have talks that happen oftentimes 24 hours a day. They'll have installations within this. Obviously, it's the architecture itself is a moment to come and capture. That then has set up a new one. This is the Dulwich Picture Gallery. It's only in its second year now, but again, it's just starting to model itself around the Serpentine. And again, it's this notion that you're capturing a different audience. So without this installation, you might not have younger people coming to the Dulwich Picture Gallery to look at old paintings, but you're starting to use installations, these cultural moments, to attract people, to bring different people together to create that inclusion, to create those conversations that we all need to be having in public space. Avenue du Musée, also, you might know this one. This is a Canadian project. This one's called Dance Floor. I'm just looking at the caption at the bottom, 2016. So again, this is an annual installation where they close off the street. They unite the street with the museum. Otherwise, it's two lanes of traffic coursing through here, but they close it off. They make a moment for people to come together. And it's a chance for young designers to have a go at creating something doesn't need to be there forever, so they can experiment a bit, you can test it, but it does create those great moments. The Flatiron, again, this sort of leftover space in Manhattan now has this annual installation event. And what I love about installations like this is that they're interactive. So they haven't decided, let's just make a sculpture and leave it there. It's about how do you engage with that art? So this one's obviously hammocks. But certainly when we're thinking about notions of art and landscape, is how do we bring the interactivity into it? So it becomes something more than just the object. And this, I would argue, does it really well. Robson Redu, so this is in Vancouver. This actually has become so popular that they were able to completely pedestrianize this space. And I haven't had a chance to go back yet and research if it's been successful in the sense that it had that anticipation and that energy that these temporary installations brought. Because largely it's probably going to be paved now. They might bring in some food trucks and things, but this idea that there was another layer of designers having to go to bring something interesting into public space, I think is important. They had a £40,000 budget to create these installations that would last throughout the summer. And there's a number of installations. If you just Google Robson Radu, you can see all those different iterations. In Times Square, you have the Valentine's Day installation that happens again every year in February. So really, it's the notion of regularity, of anticipation. So if you live in New York, you know it's coming every February. I think there's something in that for us. We like familiarity, but also the unknown. We know that it's coming, but we don't know what it's gonna look like or what it's gonna be. This is in Montreal. So this one in particular, Impulse Bilateral Office, is now a traveling installation. So I've seen it here in London. It was brought to King's Cross. It's been at Harvard University inside the historic quad. So again, ideas of traveling installations, particularly ones that are interactive, where you could sit on either side of this giant seesaw and have fun with your family or your friends, I think is also increasingly important. Here it is outside Harvard. Here it is in King's Cross. So it is moving around the world as an incredible piece. And then the other thing I thought worth really discussing with you is this idea of how uses are shaping design. And I would say this project, Central Green Navy Yards by Field Operations, really signifies the way in which the uses can begin to dictate scale, layout, etc. So this is really, the whole design is derived from a series of programs. You have the amphitheater, obviously, you have bocce, petanque, you have a hammock grove, you have the picnic tables, you have some open-ended lawn spaces, you have the fitness, and then it's all held together with the activity in the running track. So we're starting to think about how individual uses begin to dictate the layout, the scale, the composition of space as well. And this was one of the more fun ones to also design in the book. I don't know if you're seeing that so well, but it was quite intricate, really detailed, fun one to really deconstruct and to start to think about what are those component pieces. How did the designers at Field Operations determine how big they should be? So those are the conversations I'm having with my team. Now, how big should this be? How do we know how big it should be? What sort of spaces have we stood in where it felt right and was performing in a similar way? And that's the great thing I would say as designers, is we have the ability to walk through someone else's imagination, right? I can think of no other discipline where you can be inside someone's brain and learn from them every day just by going to work or going to get a coffee or walking through. You're absorbing all of the way in which challenges have been resolved or imagination is there for us to really learn from. The other one is the Goods Line in Sydney by Aspect Studios. So this is a similar concept to the Field Operations Central Green one, but it's on a linear organization. So it's allowing that central spine of movement and then having these rooms off of it have a very specific use. You have the amphitheater, you have table tennis, you have fitness, and you'll come to see there's kind of common tropes about what we're seeing in space. And that's I think a challenge for us to be more creative, to be more site specific. What can these moments within your spaces be that aren't ubiquitous, that aren't generic, that aren't the same things that you're seeing in London, New York, elsewhere? There's something specific about the space in which you're designing for. A couple of images of that project as well. These slides are really where I hope we're going. There's not many yet that suggest it, but this idea that we could have control over how we reconfigure space. Power participants to have the power to shift and move things around. This is lent space by Interborough Partners. It's a meanwhile space, and it creates, it's a plot of land that doesn't have a function yet. It hasn't been sold off by a developer, etc. So it's a meanwhile way in which they're bringing life to it. But they have this great frame, this great edge condition that can close off, it can open up, but you're in control of it, right? You're the person who comes and said, actually, I want to sit in the sun. I'm going to move this piece and I'm going to sit in the sun. Or you're an event organizer and you want to have that edge condition, you close it off and you have a private room, right? You may have seen this one, the idea of hydraulics, where day-to-day it's just a flat surface, but you can begin to have some playfulness and bring seating opportunities, tables for people to come together. This project by Matthew Mazzotta, he's an artist who I've started following him more and more. I think his work is incredible. But a couple of his installations that are both object but also performative. So open house in the bottom, which is it's signifying the loss of housing, the way in which the urban grain in Detroit is falling away because there's not the investment, houses are being sold off. And he's making a moment of that poetically, but also he's creating a moment for the community to come back together. And so this house unfolds, becomes a place that you come and sit and watch an outdoor cinema. And the same thing at the top is Storefront Theater in Nebraska, where it's just a storefront that has no occupation in it. And again, he's speaking to the decline of the streets, the fact that shops are closing down. How can you then bring life back into it? And this is great. This idea of bringing a theater, the screen out by tractor and allowing people to sit and come together as a community is pretty incredible. And then the bottom is, the idea of reconfigure space with a big budget. This is a project by OMA at an architecture school where they have these ginormous leather lounger chairs for when they're having board meetings that collapse into the floor when they need to have an event in the theater, right? Just an incredible orchestration of these things collapsing into the floor. Let's see if I can play this. This might work. It might be a bit of a risk, but this is an installation at the Matee Garden Festival, where if it's going to work, maybe. Here we go. The air. Except all. So it's called I Like to Move It by 6A Architects. You may have seen this, but this idea that you can actually move shade around and have control about where your trees are going to go, where they're going to sit, how you begin to define space like that. And this also speaks to the importance of garden festivals and these places where we can challenge architectural ideas and be more progressive as well. I'll stop that and get back into the presentation. And then we see it more dramatically with the recently completed shed by Diller Scofidio in New York. And this is, I would say, the ultimate idea of flexible space, where you create a plaza, but you also have this enormous piece of architecture that can slide out, create a roof, creates a contained space that has theater apparatus in the roof that allows you to have lighting and installation and things as well. So this is the ultimate privately owned public space being activated and being thought about. How can we make the most of this space that we have? And it's a moment in itself when this giant piece of the building slides out to cover the space. Nadia, are we all right for time? Probably got another 10 minutes or so. Okay. So I mentioned that this essay by Anita Beresbetia called Scales of Undecidability. And I think this largely is where we are now. So instead of flexibility, we might now think more precisely in terms of scales of undecidability. By this, I mean the landscape's capacity for precision of form, notwithstanding flexibility of program, for the precisely open rather than the vaguely loose. Through this framework, we are able to reject the notions that landscapes are either naturalistic and formless or object-like and formful. And I've underlined precisely open rather than vaguely loose. And what I take from this is this notion of scale. I mentioned that earlier. This idea that we can control what the precisely opened is. What is that open-ended, flexible plaza where we might have events, where we might have installations, where we might have performances? How do you determine how big that precisely open should be, rather than just say, let's have these huge plazas that yes, they can have huge crowds, but on a day-to-day basis, they feel enormous. They feel uninviting. They don't have any intimacy. So for me, and I hope I can challenge you all as you're starting to design in this way, is to really fight for the precisely open, to really fight for the combination of the everyday. How does it feel for the people that we use these spaces every day because they're working there or living there, versus those moments where you want celebration, you want people to come together, you want crowds, you want them to swell. This is Chris Reed Stoss Landscape Urbanism's work at the Harvard Plaza. And to me, these diagrams speak to trying to get under the skin or get to the heart of what Anita's talking about with the precisely open rather than loosely vague. They're testing, they're saying, how is the space going to use? What is the capacity? What is the layout? Where are those moments of intimacy? Where are those moments of huge crowds around graduation? How do we think about different edge configurations? How do we think about those quieter, more intimate parts of the space? So these diagrams, I think, are probably as important as any other process in the design that we're doing now, because we're thinking about use. We're thinking about what Corner described around verb. How is it performing? What is it doing rather than what is it just looking like? So when I was at the GSD, I was in the thick of trying to come up with the first chapter for this book. And I had just bought a drone. So I flew a drone up to get a sense of how this layout works. And this project is largely an open plaza. It is a tabula rasa in a sense. So whether they were able to achieve that precisely open versus the loosely vague could be debated. But a couple of things to point out here. Along this edge, you can see, particularly in the winter, they were creating these rooms, these more intimate pockets that you could sit underneath Rus typhina, underneath sumac trees. And again, the importance of that edge condition. Now, your back is to this building. You're looking out across the open plaza. You're looking into the sun. So in a way, you are creating those intimate moments, and you still have the open-ended, indeterminate spaces that have, you can see the market being laid out here. You can see the winter overlay of the ice skating rink. You can see the predetermined marquee that's needed for graduation. So some of these were fixed program pieces that they had to accommodate, but they're still trying to break down the scale of this as well. This one has a lot of stuff going on. So there's been a lot of overlay elements. And Chris, if you hear him speak and you challenge him, he'll say he felt that this was overprogrammed, and it wasn't his doing. Projects for Public Spaces was brought in. And so there's this tension between Chris Reed as the designer, Projects for Public Space that were trying to bring life and activate it, and the amount of stuff that then ultimately lands in the space. And this is, a collection of some of those elements that you might see. I mentioned earlier this idea of seating as sculpture. So when it's not used as a place to sit, it has sculptural beauty. These crafted, I would say, they're beautifully crafted, grasshopper scripted pieces of furniture that I'm sure weren't cheap, but they have this element of beauty to them. And I think that's important to think about. That they could have just specified some furniture off the shelf and popped it in here, but it wouldn't have had the same quality, it wouldn't have the same appearance, it wouldn't have had that sense of something unique and special about the place as well. Just a couple of images. So these are actually pages from the book starting to show the different ways in which it's used. This is a great one where they bring fire pits out. The fire department is right here. So they were able to do that because the fire department was so close. So they were able to negotiate this thing. Can we have an open fire pit on the campus? And that's how they were able to do it. The other thing to point out with this project also is at this end, they have a number of food trucks that come every day. So there's that day-to-day activation in a relatively small portion of the site. So this creates, in a way, a smaller scale of activity, and this can still be large and open and flexible, but you have that more intimate moment that people might use every day. And obviously Peter Walker's Tanner Fountain, an icon, I would say, of the early design, sits there as well as a destination. So you have a relationship between those two uses. Okay, I'm at an hour, so I can stop there and take some questions, or I can delve in and show a little bit more about the structure of the book. What do you think?
So that's fine.